Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. And today I'm here for a second time with Dr. Robert Sapolsky, who is the John A. and Cynthia Gunn Professor of Biology and Professor of Neurology and of Neurosurgery at Stanford University. So, Dr. Sapolsky, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thanks. Glad to be back.
Okay, great. So last time we talked a little bit about, how we should think about this idea of different disciplines being different buckets and then how to integrate them to explain some behavior. And I would like to ask you today, looking at these different disciplines that we have to integrate, how should we approach the question of trying to explain how a particular behavior occurs? For example, how should we answer the question of what causes a particular behavior to occur?
Well, I think it depends on if you're like a scientist who's actually trying to find out new facts about questions like that. There's like a pragmatic reality. It's very, very hard to be both an endocrinologist and a sociologist, or to be both a psychotherapist and a primatologist sort of thing. And almost by definition, you really have to do your research in one or maybe two disciplines, just the nature of like how obsessive and narrow research is. So that's okay if neurochemists only study neurochemistry. It's not okay if they then decide that neurochemistry is the only explanation for the world. So I think that's in the realm of scientists where you have to balance the pragmatism of like doing research with don't get overly impressed with your research. But for everyone else, I think if you truly are going to be making statements about where behavior comes from, especially behaviors that you're judging people for, punishing people for, and so on, I think it is not only intellectually necessary, but morally necessary to remember that any behavior we have is the outcome of more than a lifetime's worth of biological influences that came beforehand. And you really do have to, if not incorporate every single one of those elements, recognize nevertheless that every single one of those elements played a role.
Mm-hmm. So, in your book, Behave, for example, you talk about what happens 1 second before, 1 hour before, a million years before. Is it correct to say that, for example, or a set of genes, a set of neurons, a set of neurotransmitters, or something like that caused a particular behavior?
Yeah, and that's exactly the temptation if you've just spent your last 80 years spending 80 hours a week thinking about one neurotransmitter, to not only inflate its importance, but to inflate its causal power. If you find like you do a behavior, you do nothing more exciting than flex the muscles in your index finger, and if by doing so you have just pulled the trigger on a gun, to say, oh, which are the neurons that are responsible for sending that excitatory signal to those muscles, is absurd, because those neurons fired because other neurons fired before that, and those fired because other ones fired before that, and at every one of those junctures, everything from what was happening a minute before to the evolution of those neurotransmitter systems have something to do with why that wound up happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so another question about self-control. Since you don't believe in free will, how do you think about self-control without believing in free will?
It's hard because it requires internalization of standards. And when you look at sort of the classical cognitive models of moral development in kids, this guy associated with this guy, Lawrence Kohlberg at Harvard in the 1960s, he was kind of the king of that field. What you see is this big arc from why should you keep yourself from doing something bad? And the earliest stage developmentally is because I might get caught and get punished. And then you proceed to a level where you don't do that because there's rules. There's rules, and rules are good things in and of itself, or what would happen to society if everybody started that kind of level. And then only a subset of individuals getting to the third stage because of saying, well, I don't do that because I don't care about the rules. And in fact, I don't care if I even get punished for refusing to do that. That's not who I am. That is not the internal image of who I find to be like morally consonant with my sense of myself. And in some ways, once you're getting rid of like self-control as a manifestation of free will, all we can be left with is sort of the sense of internal consistency. And if you don't want to frame that as, well, how about our internal moral self-image in a world in which we're nothing but biological organisms? If nothing else, it just feels kind of unsettling to be inconsistent, to say over and over, it's a bad thing to rob people, but here's why it's okay for me to do it. Even just on that level, there's a dissonance of that's not how you thought of yourself as being an outlier. So I think that's one of the ways in which self-control still slips in there. We have a biologically based, very strong internal image of who we are and who we expect ourselves to be.
Mm-hmm. You touched on the question of morality there. So I would like to ask you, do we know how people learn right from wrong? I mean, I'm not asking you how we should determine what's right and what's wrong, but how do people acquire their morality, basically? I mean, does it have some innate aspects to it? Is it all environmental, or how does it work exactly?
Not surprisingly, I think a combination of both. In terms of how hardwired things like empathy, a sense of justice are, I think it's enormously important to see that we're not the only species that have rudiments of exactly those things. Rats will work at pressing a lever in order to have another rat no longer receive shocks. Chimpanzees will react differently to another individual if that individual has just been beaten by someone higher ranking for no reason at all, which evokes empathy and more social grooming, than if this guy was an idiot and started the fight when he shouldn't have. In which case, we're not the only species that shows rudiments of that. Moreover, it involves some similar parts of the brain. When you get damage to certain brain regions in humans, you see a loss of the capacity for empathy, and it's the same circuitry in a primate or a rodent. Some of the same hormones are involved, and even some of the specializations. Wow, we humans were capable of so much empathy. Yeah, but it depends on who it is we're thinking about. We feel a lot more empathy for someone who feels like an us than for someone who feels like a them. And that seems, that's very cultural and that's very human specific. Amazingly, you take a lab rat and ask whether it will work pressing a lever to decrease the pain of another rat, and the answer is the same exact thing. It depends on who the rat is. If it's a rat that you know and like, you do it. If it's a rat who's a stranger, you don't. If it's a rat who's a stranger who nevertheless is genetically almost identical, you feel empathy. If it's an unrelated them, you don't at all. Okay, so we've got all those ways in which that spreads, and where we're looking at a biology that's much deeper than humans themselves. But at the same time, there's obviously incredible human specific ones, because some of us out there consider us to be all living things, and others consider us to be people who dress like me or pray like me or love like me or whatever. And that's all acculturation. I mean, there's certain fault lines that make it easier for us to learn certain us them dichotomies and build our moral systems on that than some other us them dichotomies. People who look very different, that's one that sets off all sorts of evolutionary bells in our heads more readily than people who think about economic deontology differently than you do. Yeah, it's easy. But nonetheless, how it winds up at the end of the day, that one is very human specific and very culture specific, and thus very learned early in life.
Mhm. So you mentioned other species. How do you look at the relationship between humans and the species that are the closest to us, like, for example, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and so on, in terms of the differences and similarities we have with them?
I think the most impressive thing is, of course, how dramatic the similarities are and how dramatic the differences are simultaneously. Say, for example, chimps. 40 years ago, the dogma was humans were the only species that had organized violence. Jane Goodall showed that was not the case. Chimps will have organized border patrols by all the males in a group, significantly, who are usually brothers or cousins, where if they encounter a male from another group, they will kill him in an organized way. And has been documented a few times now. This could go far enough that a group of chimps will kill every single male in the neighboring population and expand their territory at that point. This is virtually the United Nations definition of genocide. Killing someone, trying to kill all the members of someone simply because of the group they are in rather than their individual characteristics. So, oh my God, we're just like chimps. It's exactly the same. But then we're totally different, because unlike chimps and every other animal on this planet, we're capable of killing another member of our species, and we never see their face. We could press a button from 30,000 feet up in the air or operate a drone on the other side of the planet, kind of thing. Or at the same time, we have the same wiring, the same basic neurobiology of empathy as do other primates and rats. And oh, it's so similar and so similar. And we can feel enormous pain for someone we've never met who lives on the other side of the planet. We could feel enormous pain for a fictional character, for a character in a movie who's nothing but like computer-generated pixels. So what we see is we have the same basic blueprint for being awful to each other or being wonderful to each other as lots of other social species, but we then use that basic blueprint in ways that are just totally unique.
Mhm. By the way, since you mentioned those more, let's say, aggressive, violent behaviors exhibited by chimps, for example, do you think that, or would you say that war is part of human nature in any way? Because, I mean, there's that approach taken by people like Steven Pinker, for example, that look at the archaeological data and say that war was always present during our evolutionary history and in traditional societies like hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists, for example. But I remember that in your book you mentioned the work by Brian Ferguson, for example, that looked at the same data And it seems that Pinker exaggerated it a little bit. Right.
Well, as you allude to, this is hugely controversial, and one of the most bizarre things on earth is sort of the spectacle of a conference full of anthropologists viciously fighting with each other about questions of peace, um, and where like you could mock another anthropologist by saying, "Oh, they're just a peace anthropologist," which for people like Pinker usually means, "Oh, they're soft-headed and sentimental, and they just want to believe in like nice." Magical fairy tales about human goodness. I think Pinker is absolutely correct in his documentation of the world becoming a more humane place in the last 4 centuries or so. I don't think that has happened anywhere near as much as he says. And he mostly focuses on the Western world. And I think one of the most clever ways that the Western world has figured out to be awful in the last half century or so is to get people in the developing world to have your wars for you and things of that sort. But nonetheless, I think this is a much more humane planet than it was 400 years ago. Where the whole controversy comes in is, okay, if things were horrible 400 years ago, 500 years ago, most people saw no problem with slavery, with spousal abuse, with child labor, with beating your animal to death, sort of thing. And wow, hasn't that changed a lot? The question becomes, well, have we been that way for millions of years? Or have we been that way for maybe the last 5 to 10 to 15,000 years? And Pinker's absolutely of the school where this is what we've been like for the last million years or so. This is deeply, deeply embedded in our hominid core. And people like the primatologist Richard Wrangham at Harvard has very much sort of staked his view on that field. And then there's people who make what I think is the far, far more convincing stance that traditional nomadic hunter-gatherers, which is what humans have been for 99% of their history, had very low levels of organized warfare. And organized violence of the type that begins to get words like war and genocide was pretty much invented with humans becoming sedentary, no longer being nomadic, humans inventing agriculture. So you had so much surplus calories that you could have people who specialized in their work and people who specialized in just trying to kill the people in the next valley. I think the archaeological, the paleontological record, I think is absolutely clear that warfare in the organized sense is 10, 20,000 years old. I think it is one of the many ways in which, like, one of the stupidest things humans ever did was invent agriculture and settle down and start doing that. But that is, this is endlessly debated. And it comes down to like not only like philosophical arguments about the nature of humans, but like arguments over, okay, here's a 20,000-year-old human femur bone, and there's gnaw marks on it, like scrapes on it or not. Was that caused by human teeth, implying cannibalism, or was that caused by hyena teeth? Mm-hmm. Like, some of the arguments play out on that kind of level for making sense of violence. Okay, if you find a skeleton in this 20,000-year-old grave and the skeleton has an arrowhead in it, is that because that person was killed by an arrow, an act of violence, or was that person buried with their hunting tools as some ceremonial thing? Like, it comes down to arguments like that, but nevertheless, overwhelmingly, I think I'm of the school where we do not have a million-year-old hominid legacy of organized violence. It's a much, much more recent invention. That's not what our nomadic hunter-gatherer past was about.
Yeah. Don't you think that we also have to include in the picture some violence diffusing mechanisms that humans have? Because, I mean, we have these violent behaviors and tendencies, but we also have ways to try to prevent violence from occurring.
Yes, and I think one of the traditional ways that that worked really well for 99% of human history is that nomadic hunter-gatherers, the picture used to be that there was a high degree of inbreeding within each band. So that you could think of them being nice to each other because they're all kind of relatives. And what both contemporary studies of contemporary hunter-gatherers and sort of paleogenomics has shown that no, in fact, there was a lot of gene flow between groups. What does that mean? It means that hunter-gatherers, and this is seen anthropologically today with hunter-gatherer groups, when there's enormous tensions, one of the best solutions out there is, oh, I'm going to go stay in this band, this other band, for the next 6 months or so until things quiet down. A great deal of fluidity of group membership moving in and out. And that is traditionally a really good way for decreasing conflict. That said, and amid sort of a whole song and dance about how wonderful our hunter-gatherer past was without violence and all of that, the studies indicate that contemporary hunter-gatherers, a guy is just as likely to murder another guy over sexual competition for a woman as would be the case in the middle of, I don't know, Chicago or Moscow or something. Individual violence is pretty much the same root causes, male-male competition and male aggression turned on females when they are not getting their way. And it's for the same reasons and with roughly the same frequency. Individual humans have been being awful to each other just as much and for the same reasons for probably hundreds of thousands of years as they are now. But the level of warfare, I think the basic fluidity of hunter-gatherer bands was one of the solutions to that.
Mm-hmm. So we are here talking about behavior in general and some specific behaviors. When it comes to decision making, how important is the role played by emotions? Because when we think about decision making, sometimes we have this tendency to separate reason or even cognition in general from emotions, and to say that emotions are pretty much irrational, but they sort of play an important role there as well. Right?
This is like a hugely important issue. And if you went back, I don't know, 50, 60 years ago or so, people thinking about this, any like reasonable, sensible, serious scientist would emphasize the cognitive roots of decision making, the cognitive roots of morality, and the only people who would say it's all about emotion were obviously like artists and like dancers or who knows what. And that turns out not to be the case in the slightest. In the realm of moral decision making, what's clear is factors like how readily you are disgusted by things, how readily you are made anxious by novelty, are enormous predictors as to who you decide is acting morally and who isn't, who you decide is an us and a them. In the more formal world of decision making, what's become clear is emotions are driving the process much, much more than people used to think, and maybe even the majority of the time. Wonderful researcher Jonathan Haidt at New York University is the person who's most emphasized this, showing how often, well, on the level of neuroimaging, you can see that a predictable profile, a decision, has been made in more emotional parts of the brain than more cognitive parts, artificially what would be termed the limbic system versus the cortex. You can predict what's going on from looking at the limbic system before you can from the cortex. On the level of just phenomenology, what you get is that whole world of people who would say, I can't quite tell you why, but that's wrong when they do that. That's really, really wrong. I just thought of the reason why it's wrong when they do that. When you see that, that is absolutely a measure that emotions are leading. And what seems like rational cognition is just your cortical self running afterward to try to say, no, 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 that's actually makes sense. Here's why I actually decided that in the first place. And sort of in some ways, the best demonstration of that is experimental. When you manipulate somebody's emotional or affective or visceral or implicit or non-conscious biology, they make different moral decisions. And you ask them afterward, oh, that's really interesting. You decided it's okay to do this to that person, but not to this other person. And they'll come up with some like high fancy philosophy to try to rationalize it. And it's simply because of those other factors. I mean, one of my favorite examples of this is this study. You sit people down and you give them a questionnaire about their political views, social politics, which is often tapping into issues of moral judgments as to what's right and what's wrong about behavior, but also economics and geopolitical. Should we be trading with Thailand this way versus that way kind of thing? You sit them down and they go through a whole questionnaire. And if somebody is sitting in a room with a bad smell in it, they become more politically conservative, only in terms of social issues. Doesn't change their economics, doesn't change their geopolitics, but they are more likely in the United States to say that gay marriage should not be legal. It's not right when those people want to do that. And then they will explain to you a whole moral philosophy as to how they got there. And it's because the room smelled disgusting at a subliminal level. And on some level, their emotional limbic brains were sitting there saying, weird, something's disgusting, I know they're disgusting when they do that. That should be. When you get somebody making moral decisions like that and trying to explain it rationally afterward, and all you've done is manipulate something affective and emotional and sensory and visceral in them, what you've just proven is that we are much, much less rational creatures than we like to think of ourselves as.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting that we have things occurring at the subconscious and also at the conscious level. Does the way we feel about something, I mean, some behavior that we have or something that happens to us, depend on the context? I mean, is it that, for example, the same set of neural activation or the same levels of hormones can generate different feelings on people depending on the context they're in?
Sure, absolutely. And, one of the best demonstrations of that is one of the classic experiments that's in every textbook that was done back in the 1960s. An American psychologist named Stanley Schachter, where the Schachter experiment, and you would never be able to do this to people these days. But what he did was he took people and he gave them adrenaline. The hormone very involved in sort of the fear-flight response. Epinephrine is what it's also known as, adrenaline, without telling them. They said, here's a great new vitamin that we want you to take and see that we're going to come in and measure your something or other and see what happens. So people were getting the slow-acting version of it. What does it do? It makes your heart beat faster. It increases your blood pressure. All those things, subtle, nothing major, and like they were not giving people like heart attacks or whatever. They gave young subjects adrenaline. And then they had them come to where they were now going to be tested and had them sit in the waiting room for their appointment. And the experiment, of course, took place in the waiting room, where there was another person in there. And half the time, the other person was sitting there saying, this is outrageous. I was supposed to, 1 o'clock. They said I had a 1 o'clock appointment. Look at it. It's 1:20. I'm late. My car is going to get ticketed. I'm going to be late for class, whatever. This is outrageous. And the other half of the time, the person is sitting there saying, whoa, are you in for one of these experiments? Me too. These are so interesting. Are you studying psychology? Me too. And what you saw was that giving somebody adrenaline without their knowing that increased the intensity of their emotional expressiveness. But if it was sitting in a room with somebody complaining, they were soon complaining to the poor receptionist there, saying, "This is outrageous. I'm late now also." And if they were with somebody who was very gregarious and extroverted and friendly, before you knew it, they were saying, "Hey, we should get dinner together sometime." So what you see there is the physiology helps explain the intensity of the emotions expressed, but context had everything to do with which those emotions were.
So it's interesting that you're touching on adrenaline, for example, in this case, because I wanted to ask you a little bit about your work on the effects that stress have on people and, for example, on baboons. So, I mean, what are the effects that stress has, and what are some of the differences between baboons and humans? Because I would guess that humans would have more sources of stress, I guess, because they also are more socially complex.
Well, for me, the most interesting thing have been the similarities. In addition to my being sort of a neurobiologist doing lab work for decades and decades, I spent 30 years spending 3, 4 months a year also studying wild baboons in East Africa. And the question I looked at was stress. Who was getting the stress-related diseases? What did that have to do with their social systems or whatever? And it turned out baboons were perfect as models for human stress. If you're a baboon living in the Serengeti in East Africa, it's a great ecosystem. It's fabulous. You live in these big troops so that the lions don't bother you very often. Your infant mortality rate is lower than you see in the humans living nearby. And you only have to work about 3 hours each day to get your food. And what that means is you have 9 hours of free time every day to devote to generating social complexity and stress and misery for other members of your species. They're exactly like westernized humans. We're not stressed because locusts have eaten our crops or because, like, the hyenas are chasing us. We're stressed because we have enough free time to construct social systems that produce psychological stress for each other. And baboons were perfect. If you're a baboon and you're stressed, it's almost certainly because some other baboon has worked very hard to bring that state around in you. It's all psychological stress. So they're perfect examples and they're great models for us. Of course, at the same time, there's those sorts of differences. You could be a low-ranking male baboon and you could be stressed because a high-ranking jerky male, what he does is he decides to come down and sit right next to you while you're eating. And before you know it, you were too nervous and you're too anxious and you've got to pick up and go sit down 20 feet away to start eating again. And just because it's so much fun and it's boring otherwise, the high-ranking guy does it again to you. And does it again to you over and over, just because he can hassle you, and maybe he's in a bad mood today and it makes him feel better. So that looks very familiar. On the other hand, we can stress people by signing an order taking away the jobs of 20% of the people in our corporation. Or we can stress somebody by walking into a party and saying, "Oh, I didn't think you would be here," or saying, "Oh, they invited you. Isn't that what that you just psychologically harassed this other person?" No baboon could possibly understand that. Yet we do. So it's the same deal. They're very similar to us insofar as the stress in their lives are social and psychological. But of course, they can't begin to dream of the ways that we could make each other miserable.
Mhm. So I've alluded to our sociality in the previous question. Can we say that humans are also a hierarchical species?
Of course, my professorial answer is yes and no. We are not strictly territorial in the way that a lot of primates are. Female baboons, for example, there's a dominance hierarchy, and your rank is going to be one below that of your mother. You inherit your rank. In other words, it's not doesn't even make sense to talk about a female's rank. It only makes sense to talk about the rankings of her family. Oh, they're a high-ranking lineage, they're a low-ranking lineage, whatever. Like, we don't have strict stuff like that in the majority of human cultures over history, but we're certainly hierarchical, and we can rise and fall in our hierarchies. The thing that's most interesting about us that differentiates us from any other social species is we can belong to multiple hierarchies at the same time. And while we could be high ranking in one and low ranking in another, we can do all sorts of psychological tricks to, of course, make it seem like the hierarchy in which we're highest ranking is the one that's most important. So you get somebody, who works in some big corporation, and he's got the worst conceivable job there. He's the person who every day who throws out the garbage. Wow, he's at the bottom of the hierarchy, but he's the captain of the company's football team. And you better bet when he sits around and talks about what's important in his life, it's some stupid job 40 hours a week. But when the team gets together, and we do that. You get a poor person who nonetheless is a respected elder in their church. And, that's two different hierarchies. We're very good at taking psychological comfort from inflating the importance of the hierarchies in which we're doing best. So we're very different from any other species in that way, the fact that we can do that.
Mm-hmm. And can we say that we are obedient to authority figures in general? Because, back in the 60s, 70s, or somewhere around there, there were experiments like the Milgram experiments and the Stanford Prison experiment, but it seems that they have been questioned, at least to some extent, particularly more so the Stanford Prison experiment, and there's more nuance to them than people previously thought. Right?
Exactly. The worst versions of what people came away with, what things like the Milgram or the Stanford experiment showed was, oh my God, every one of us could have been a Nazi. Oh my God, every one of us would be willing to fall. And even just reading those studies for what they were, they didn't remotely show that. They seemingly were showing, oh my God, the majority of us could be. But you're absolutely right. In the years since, people have understood much better. For example, in the Stanford prison experiment, a big design flaw was that the person running the experiment, the psychologist Phil Zimbardo, who's a colleague of mine who I adore and who's wonderful, nonetheless, he did a bad step in there in that he was the warden of this prison that was set up. He was not an outside. So the guards very much wanted to do what they perceived to be what he was hoping for. And replications since then have shown very different outcomes. The Milgram studies have shown that, in fact, far more people said, are you crazy? I'm not going to shock this person, or decided this is not for real, that's an actor, than people came away with. So I think the safest thing to come away from with those studies is the same thing that 20th century history taught all of us, which is probably a lot more people are willing to do awful, terrible things in the name of conforming with a group or in the name of obeying an authority figure. A lot more of them are willing to do that than we would like to think. But nonetheless, there's always a meaningful percentage of people who refuse to do that, even under the worst circumstances, and even when they have to pay the worst price possible for doing so. And there's lots of lessons to be learned from who those people are that the rest of us can pick up.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't it also depend a bit on each specific person's personality? Isn't there? Doesn't it also have to do with individual differences?
Absolutely. And people have very stable not permanent, not inevitable, but still stable more than chance, stable features to their personality as to how much comfort do they take from hierarchies, how much comfort do they take from clarity about social relationships, how much comfort do they take from clear lines of command. And there's massive individual differences in it, and there's biological roots to it, and you can see some of the roots in 2-year-old kids. You can take like 4-year-olds and you put them in a social setting, and if they're the kids who were made most anxious by the novelty there instead of this being exciting, that statistically predicts that 20 years later, they're going to be voting for conservative political parties instead of more progressive ones. So there's basic individual differences, constitutive stuff. There's basic cultural differences. But some of the most interesting stuff out there, nonetheless, is built around, even under the circumstances where you'd have to be crazy to stand up and say this is not right, people still will. And, thank God for that. And thank God we're learning something about the science of who those people are.
Mm-hmm. So I also wanted to ask you about this because later this month I will interview Robert Macaulay and his colleague because they recently released a book titled Hearing Voices and Other Matters of the Mind, where they sort of mention how certain psychopathologies might be behind, for example, religious rituals. And you also talk about that, for example, in your Stanford Human Behavioral Biology course. So how do you look at the relationship between psychopathology and religion?
I look at it very carefully and very cautiously because I've learned from lecturing about this that people hear what they want to hear and could get very angry, even threatening afterward. What fascinates me is that there are aspects of our psychology and aspects of our psychiatric normalities and abnormalities that map very well onto certain types of religions. And religiosity. And the clearest example is obsessive compulsive disorder, where somebody is completely taken over by repeating thoughts, blasphemous thoughts, disturbing thoughts, by a need to carry out repetitive rituals of movement. And you look at obsessive compulsive disorder, and every single study shows the most common symptoms are built around personal cleanliness. The second most common rituals are built around cleanliness and purification of food, fear of contamination. The third most is rituals around entering and leaving places of emotional significance. You have to tap your foot on the floor 6 times with the right foot and once with the left before you could go into this room, or else something terrible is going to happen to you. Fourth most, rituals about numbers, numerology, and symmetry. And you look at Orthodox religions and you look at Orthodox rituals, and the most common are self-cleansing. If you are an Orthodox Muslim, Jew, Christian of any denomination, Hindu, your life is filled with rituals of hand washing and cleansing, and you can eat this type of food but not that type, and here's how you prepare it, and here are magic numbers, and here's things you need to do ritualistic before and entering or leaving a place of worship and stuff. It's the exact same list. And you look at the history of some of the people who invented the rituals of religion, and before they did that, their lives were being destroyed by what absolutely looked like obsessive-compulsive disorder. And you see that in some other realms with religiosity. There was a phenomenon in the 14th century called holy anorexia, or miraculous anorexia, of women who starved themselves to death to show how much they loved God and Jesus. And you looked at the features of it, and it was the neuropsychiatric disorder anorexia nervosa. It had the exact same. what you see is, okay, am I saying you have to be crazy to be religious? Not for a second. I happen to be an atheist, but I was brought up very religiously, and I have many ways in which I miss that and respect that. No, I'm not saying everybody who's religious is crazy. I'm saying it is fascinating of religion as a cultural phenomenon, how often what it does is provide a place of sanctuary for people whose lives would otherwise be destroyed by neuropsychiatric issues. And not just sanctuary, but some of the time you do it right and you've just invented a new religion, or you can be hired to carry out these rituals and everybody thinks you're wonderful. It's a place where the same abnormalities that destroy your lives in other settings of psychiatry, they take care of you, and maybe even they proclaim you as being wonderful in a context of religion. And that's fascinating, and that's, like, in lots of ways, a wonderfully humane thing that religion can do.
So, do we have time for one final question?
Yeah.
Okay, so this question comes from a patron of mine, and he says, it seems that the rate of mutation for genes related to primates' vocal tract is higher than in other mammal species. I would like to know if this allows us to understand when vocalizations as language appeared in our lineage, and if there is any species of primate that might be close to acquiring language.
Great. Wonderful question. To expand on it even a bit, not just sort of the anatomy of our vocal tracts, but there's a gene that, like, behavior geneticists love. It's called FOXP2, and people discovered it, I don't know, some decades ago, and found that mutations in it were associated with families that had communication disorder. Perfectly intelligent, whatever, but they could never master speech, or they had problems with syntax, or, whoa, isn't that interesting? And then it was discovered that FOXP2 is found in all the other primates. And then it's found in birds that sing, and it's found in rodent species that vocalize. Whoa, okay, so this has something very fundamental to do with vocalization. But then you see that, one, genetically, the FOXP2 gene is incredibly similar and conserved across all those other species, and ours is really, really different. And ours evolved its differences very recently in the last couple of 100,000 years or so. And what that tells you is, yeah, our communicatory abilities are built from the same building blocks as songbirds and all of that, and some of the same genetic things, but we've done some amazing things with it, novel, very, very recently, evolutionarily. So one would conclude from that not language, that's human specific. But then you see all sorts of weird hints out there, which is, for example, there's an asymmetry in the structure of the cortex on one side of it versus the other, having to do with language use in humans. And then you look at other apes, and you look at monkey species, and you don't see as much of an asymmetry there, but there's a little bit of one. In other words, some of the ways that our sequence variants of that FOXP2 gene that's totally unique to humans were different than other species, but some of the other features of the biology of language is on a continuum. Yeah, we're absolutely the only ones with language, but we're not the only ones who could do fancy, subtle stuff with communication that takes fancy brains.
Okay, so Dr. Sapolsky, let's end the interview here, and thank you again for taking the time to come on the show, and I hope to have you again on the show somewhere in the future. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, I'd be happy to, and thank you for the opportunity, and I hope everyone is virus-free out there.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to consider making a pledge on Patreon. I have the link in the description box, or on PayPal. You can also find the links there. And otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters on PayPal: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Paroga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Fredrik Sunde, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enrique Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Paulo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormer, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hughney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Staten T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Ethan Solon, Romain Roch, Dmitry Grigoriev, and Diego Londoño Correa. My producers, Isar Webe, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luis Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran. And my executive producers, Michal Rojewski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.